Deacon Dr. Bob McDonald is an award-winning medical doctor, a successful Catholic psychotherapist and author on family issues, and a permanent deacon of the Catholic Church. In 1987, he was honored as Canadian Family Physician of the Year for his leadership in training doctors and nurses for the medical relief effort during the Great Famine in Ethiopia. He personally led the first of these teams into the famine-stricken country. He was ordained a permanent deacon for the Diocese of Pembroke, Ontario in 1992. Since then, Deacon Bob has made many appearances on Canadian television and has traveled widely in this country, giving talks, retreats, and preaching parish missions. Now, here's Deacon Dr. Bob McDonald.
Scripture tells us in Matthew 21:13 that Jesus shouted, "My house shall be a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of thieves." In other words, his Father's house. And this is the key to Jesus' reaction. He was acting purely on behalf of his Father, not on behalf of himself. He was indignant at the incredible offense being given to God in his house by the profanation of God's holy temple. Jesus was displaying the holy anger of God. As the perfectly pure one, he had the right to purify the temple. But you and I, as human creatures, we're not pure enough to be purifiers. We cannot and must not equate our petty human self-centered anger with the righteous and just wrath of God. God's anger is holy, but apart from a truly just anger, ours is never holy. And then we are told in John 2:17, when Jesus was cleansing the temple, that his disciples recalled the words of Scripture, "Zeal for your house will consume me." In other words, Jesus was displaying a righteous indignation, a zeal for the temple, not giving in to a self-indulgent rage. There is a printed handout distributed by a pregnancy center in the United States which teaches the following erroneous ideas about anger. Number 1, anger brings about needed change, good change. 2, anger can make an impression for truth. We get honest. 3, anger is a strong motivator. It makes us move. 4thly, anger can be used to rebuke or correct. Jesus got his point across. Now, I can not agree with any one of those statements. As a Christian, I reply that the emotion of anger is a sin. Therefore, number 1, anger does bring about change, but never good change. Number 2, anger never makes an impression for truth, because the thoughts which generate our anger are always distorted. Number 3, anger is indeed a strong motivator. It makes us want to hurt someone and do something about it. Number 4, anger can be used to rebuke or correct, but it always over-rebukes and over-corrects. And it is a blasphemy to compare Jesus' anger with our sinful anger. Yes, Jesus did get his point across, but it was not in sin. So what do the Scriptures have to say about anger? It is impossible, I suppose, to appeal to a higher authority than Jesus himself. His actual words are above any challenge, and we are obliged to give them our total obedience. And so, Jesus states in Matthew 5:21 and 22, "You have heard it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you, that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to the hell of fire." Jesus here is linking anger with murder. How can that be? This is a serious principle that Jesus is trying to teach us in his new teaching, the New Testament. In the very same discourse, he says in verses 27 and 28, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Therefore, according to Jesus, just thinking lustfully is in the same category as actual adultery. And so likewise, being angry is akin to murder. The reason for this is that just as lust is the precursor to adultery, so anger can so often be the precursor to murder. Anger, therefore, is not a neutral emotion. It has powerful moral implications, and Jesus warns us sternly against it. James 1:19-20. Keep this in mind, dear brothers. Let every man be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For a man's anger does not fulfill God's justice. Anger, therefore, is a sin against justice. Colossians 3:8. You must put all that aside now, all the anger and quick temper, the malice, the insults, the foul language. Even the Old Testament holds anger to be a grave sin. Proverbs 29, verse 22, the hothead provokes disputes. Someone in a rage commits all sorts of sins. There is, however, a very common misinterpretation of Scripture which many people, priests included, use to justify anger and to pass it off as simply a human emotion. And it is to be found in the words of St. Paul in Ephesians 4:26, which I quoted earlier. And Paul says, if you are angry, let it be without sin. This is so often taken to mean that it is acceptable to be angry as long as one does not sin with it. However, Paul is not suggesting that it is permissible to be sinfully angry. In the original Greek manuscript, Paul uses the word orgazese for be angry. This form is only used once in the entire Bible, and it refers specifically to an inner attitude of indignation towards a person or an injustice. In other words, Paul is talking here about righteous indignation, or just anger. He is not referring to sinful anger at all. In fact, in the very same passage, he goes on to say in verse 31, get rid of all passion and anger. So on the one hand, Paul says be angry, yet on the other, he says get rid of all anger. And so he clearly means something very different from the popular modern interpretation, since he would most certainly not contradict himself. There is then a powerful theological foundation for regarding anger as sin. And so it should be combated by means of our will and by means of God's grace. We should not excuse it. Rather, we should confess it. Nevertheless, we must have great compassion for those Christians who still struggle with anger and feel impotent against it. And this talk is not meant to inflict guilt on those who suffer with the problem. On the contrary, it is designed to bring them good news. There is freedom from anger if you want it. And that freedom will be found in truth. For as Jesus promises in John 8:32, the truth will set you free.